Yeah, so hello everyone, and thanks for joining us on this discussion on restaking, cryptoeconomics, and the role of cryptography. I think we've just gone through the introduction, so let's just dive in. So, Robert, I just wanted to start with you. So, Eigenlayer has been sort of at the vanguard of the restaking movement, and most recently, you have kind of launched a new sort of cryptoeconomic security model. So, I just wanted to ask you, how does Eigenlayer think about cryptoeconomic security in general? And why the move to the new model, and what does it change?
Yeah, I think maybe a good thing to just kind of level set is that EigenLayer's new shared security model is actually pretty similar to Ethereum's original smart contract layer DApp shared security model. And I'll talk about the difference of sort of the execution plane, but both from like what they're actually providing, both have this shared security aspect because people kind of associate shared security with things like restaking and others. But if you look at a base L1 chain, the security, which means the cost of corruption of causing reverts, a change in the history, is what you mean by security. And it's cryptoeconomic. It's never absolute, of course. And for any DApp that's running a smart contract on Ethereum, they don't have infinite security. And furthermore, their risk of corruption goes up if they happen to be in a block where there's a multi-billion-dollar transaction by somebody else. So it's strictly shared in that sense. The main difference between EigenLayer and Ethereum is that instead of a VM smart contract execution machine, it instead allows that that security to be bound from the Ethereum layer 1, either ETH itself, the intersubjective eigentoken that allows layer 2 forking by protocols, or any other ERC20 that finally settles at L1. The main difference is the execution now is just for decentralized peer-to-peer nodes running any decentralized protocol. And a lot of the early AVSs are closer to VMs, so they look more like EVMs or Cosmos-style execution planes. But you could actually think about Filecoin type proof of space time, or not proof of you would call it like a proof of space time attributions. You could consider CDN networks. You could consider all sorts of other things. And they're sharing that pool. It's just that now they're sharing their faults on a peer-to-peer network commit versus on a validator commit against an EVM consensus.
Maybe just elaborate a little bit more on the change that you guys made recently, the sort of unique stake concept that was brought forward as opposed to what was originally planned in the white paper.
Okay, and you said elaborate more. So I'm going to try to make this answer shorter since it was too long last time. It's a pretty simple idea. It's always a question. There's no default of like when Ethereum added the 1559 burn for the base fees, it made a choice, and the choice was to burn everything against the ETH asset, which is definitely ultrasound. Whenever you look at burn fees or slashing costs, actually it's more slashing, but when you look at things like slashing, you could do many different things with it. And slashing and removing it is important because you penalize the person who attributably caused the negative fault. You haven't externalized it to other parties. But you have choices on what you do with it. And so the attributable security and the ability to actually do some compensation ties into this idea that you don't necessarily have to burn it. You have to remove it from the person who's being slashed, but you can do other more cryptoeconomically beneficial things. And that's what we introduced, was an explicit mechanism for that.
Himanshu, I want to bring you in here. With this change, basically, there'll be a unique stake which can be slashed by any AVS or protocol that the operator is supporting, as opposed to a common stake that could be slashed by any AVS earlier. How does that change, in your opinion, the security model? We've seen some sort of discussion around systemic risk because of the sort of interoperability or the dependency of one AVS slashing an operator affecting another AVS. Do you think this sort of addresses that? How does that change?
So I guess I am like the user side of EigenLayer, more from the AVS side, and I think Robert was talking about what EigenLayer is thinking, and I'm sure Tarun will have a lot to say about how this affects the economy. So and Prabal, we are in the same boat about this, right? So I feel the witness chain, the project I contribute heavily to, and even in Sentient, we are looking at certain AVSs that will help us with cryptoeconomic security. One of the challenges that any AVS building any kind of business faces is that operators are there for yield, and we talk a lot about security and that balance. How do I make money as an operator when I work with you? Especially when the excitement plateaus, what happens? That had to be addressed. And this danger that in the name that because security requires stake and stake needs to be slashed when something goes wrong. At the same time, if there's any kind of yield coming, people would like to put in all huge amount of restake, right? Like so, that balance is the one which was worrying, and so separating these two out, I think, helps all the AVSs to position themselves that the slashable security would be a smaller piece, and that part helps us in positioning as an AVS. Technically, from my understanding is a little bit thin on this still. Technically, what I feel is that the kind of interdependencies that this cascading faults can cause are being mitigated by this somewhat, because you will now have this separate. I just glanced through the paper, separate sets of operator sets, and each operator set has its slashable component which cannot be reused across different operator sets. So it makes sense. It's not overused for slashing. It will just limit the amount of security available now because you are not reusing it. That's how I understand it.
And sort of just a follow up, and maybe Tarun can also chime in after that. Do you think it will increase the cost of security for the AVSs as well? I mean, ultimately, the kind of shared security or unique security model is a protection against collusion. And potentially, AVSs would now have to spend more in terms of yield to get that security.
Yeah. I haven't thought about that part. Does it reduce the cost of security? Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. But the other part of it, I think this relates to the yield part. The role of the total stake is also something interesting now. What is the role of total stake with unique stake coming out separately in this way? And that my understanding is that a lot of coordination will still happen around total stake. All the skin in the game and vanity matrices still can be built around that. That you are bringing it here, and the unique security part. How does the cost of security go up? That's not something I've thought about.
We can switch to you.
Yeah.
You guys have done some work around, looking at optimal allocation of stake, etc. So maybe your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think so basically the cascading model of security you can think of as sort of a combinatorial model for, if someone gets slashed on one AVS, does that cause an AVS that has a shared operator set to also be easier to attack, which then causes someone else to be easier to attack, ... So those chain of dependencies you can write out in terms of sort of a specific type of walk on a graph, which you can think of as like a graph of node operators on one side and services on the other, and sort of the relationship between them being codified by the graph. The main thing is if you also add in incentives where you assume that the node operators are reallocating to the different services based on the incentives, what you'll find is that in order to have low cascade risk, there needs to be low overlap between the operator sets. So that means, if for a given service, it wants sort of the maximum overlap in stake that it has with any other service to be bounded in some way. And then if it has that bound, it can say, okay, this is how much it costs to attack. And then you can kind of do things like, more in the insurable version of the world. The unique stake thing, in my mind, allows you to have a kind of granular control over that overlap of like how much stake is overlapped between multiple operators. It's just sort of a simpler way to do that. And inevitably, and I think this is just true for restaking networks, but also just generic shared security networks. So even in the sort of like Polkadot type of model, you have to have some amount of price discrimination of rewards against different types of operators, because if you don't do that, then you may be able to have sort of an AVS that's very cheap to operate, but also easy to attack, causing a security issue for one that's expensive to operate and expensive to attack. And so effectively, this is just a way of giving yourself some granular control and allowing you to price discriminate on how much you give in rewards to each of the two classes of the unique stake class and the total stake class. So for instance, maybe I give you 2 times the amount of block rewards per unit time for committing to unique stake because you have this opportunity cost of, well, if I'm putting unique stake here, then I can't get yield from other AVSs. And effectively playing with that is sort of the way to kind of achieve some of these levels of security. And there's ways to quantify it sort of in a worst case model where you assume that all slashes are complete, as in if you get slashed, your entire stake is slashed. Obviously, that's like extremely pessimistic, but you can write out bounds on the kind of costs you have. I think the average case model obviously is a lot more complicated, and so that's roughly the way I would think about this.
Robert, do you want to chime in on the question that we were asked earlier?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think Tarun's comments are really well appreciated, super knowledgeable, and really some of the best work that we've seen. I mean, I would say generally, like just philosophically, I have a view on this, which is if you have no information asymmetry, if you have very public information, the high quality thing that can happen then is that you have very smart people like Tarun and Gauntlet and so forth that are able to do models that show you realistically like what is the risk exposure you're getting. And like he's saying, security has different flavors to it. And also people do very different security choices, like, Solana versus Ethereum is like very dramatic difference. And everybody learned in the beginning about, the nothing at stake and proof of stake. So, but once it's analyzed, then you can actually have efficient price discovery. And, I think it's interesting. Like, I'll just give a quick story that when Ethereum, chose no delegate model, at all, and just went with this pure lock and everything at L1, I was a little surprised that some colleagues that I had that were closer to like the EF core were a little like almost I'd say more bummed out that all of that work then meant that there was like liquid staking markets that emerged almost right away. And, I kind of viewed it like you can have different opinions about how the liquid staking market emerged. Some are very high trusted. Others require that, kind of a senior, junior risk model. Rocket Pool is an example, but like decentralized. And so exploring different types of risk reward trade-offs are good. Unfortunately, in DeFi, we tend to learn by hacks and problems, and then we stop doing things. So it's expensive. We don't want that to happen around eigenlayer security for sure. Like we want to do a lot more measured analysis. We also have probably a different position from like an L1 like Ethereum, which was just we set this protocol. We're not going to absorb, LSTs and others. Like we're building a lot more primitives into the first layer, but then of course with liquid restaking protocols, they have to have some freedom. Then there's also stuff around the eigen token, which is different security properties. So, the net I would say is that, it's meant to be a richer model because there is different choices for what kind of security you buy, how much of it is like attributable, and then how much of it is in a bucket. And like Tarun is saying, having the right modeling, which you can see totally, which is like, what are your correlation risk factors and stuff. So I think that's generally what I would say is how we're trying to look at building it, is just creating what can be a very efficient, well-measured, risk-compensated market.
I want to sort of switch gears, talk about a little bit from the AVS perspective, Prabal. So how do you think AVS should sort of think about designing their sort of consensus or protocol from a cryptoeconomic security point of view?
Okay. No, I think like from the AVS's perspective, like there is a lot of risks and security that we are talking about. There's slashing offenses, types of slashable offenses, and so on that we are also talking about. So from an AVS's perspective, you go into the market kind of thinking that, okay, who are the operators I can attract? Right? At the end of the day, I want a high performance service. I have certain revenue in the system, I would assume, and I am okay to I'm okay to share that revenue with the operators because they host this service. There are, of course, risks about, I have to choose a protocol. For example, there is EigenLayer, of course, leading the way, and then there are others as well. And I'm like, as an AVS, you are thinking, okay, who can attract the most capital? Now, yes, you can attract more capital, but then there also comes risk that you have to give the yield, right? Because at the end of the day, the people who are contributing stake are expecting rewards, as Himanshu mentioned, right? I mean, there's a very simple market model that is going on there. And unless you can live up to it, it's going to, like at the end of the day, whatever happens to the protocol for the AVS, the service is going to collapse if I'm not able to serve the operators the way that they mentioned. And like if I'm being honest, then we have seen that happening in POS chains. Like it's not like there is a lot of novel techniques that are happening here, of course, in EigenLayer and others, but the fundamental value capture remains the same. There are so many Cosmos chains which have not been able to attract capital, which have not been able to give them the rewards, and hence failed. And when they fail, the shared security model in Cosmos has suffered. And similar things have happened with other chains as well. Now, okay, I understand that they are not exactly similar. Like the security model is not exactly the same. The role of the tokens are not the same. The shared security model is not the same. The fundamental nature of information asymmetry in each of these protocols are not the same. L1 versus L2 versus AVS, they are very different. But fundamentally, the market doesn't care too much about it. As I am serving someone wanting to run a service or have this service run by others, I'm thinking very differently than maybe the protocols are thinking. And the fact that we have to discuss on panels and discuss like what is the slashable offense, what kind of risks do I take, and so on, is not helping me, neither helping my operators.
I want to pick on something that you said, right? So till now, and maybe Himanshu, you can sort of chime in here. We've seen, because slashing isn't implemented, it's maximize your sort of economic security in terms of getting as many operators on board, as much sort of money on board. Do you think with sort of real costs coming in, that will change? There'll be a optimal economic security that every AVS would want based on their particular use case.
Yeah, I want to double click on what Prabal said. This is a very important point he was making, that there's nothing new in terms of what will happen on the demand side. There we have to innovate. So if you want to provide quick finality, let's say just a fast finality, and you are providing extra security for that, it better be worth it. So that part of it, the value remains the same. What EigenLayer has done very nicely is that now it has given a programmable layer to capture all these different values, EigenLayer and maybe other services, but for us, EigenLayer, at different levels. So if we are doing a network level proof and we need security, of course, the economic value of that can be very low, and you don't need the whole muscle of that whole $8 billion stake that we have in Witness Chain. But at the same time, if you can go to those DeFi contracts, those bridges which work out and where the high risk assets are, and that makes more sense to be there. So it's just a programmable layer which now can be used to capture things at different value. It doesn't free us from now creating those high value transactions. So I think the one has to still innovate and look for those different use cases, and now you have a layer where you have security and your yield can be programmed according to that. I don't think that changes part. Does it relate to your second question as well? Say it again, sorry.
Maybe you can sort of throw it up to the panel, right? So the idea that AVSs will be able to sort of define very clearly how much economic security they want in terms of...
I mean, as an AVS, sorry to interrupt, but as an AVS, I want maximum security. Maximum security.
Then you have to pay for it as well, right? So there's a limiting function in terms of how much revenue you can generate.
Of course. I'm saying like I have limitations in my capability to accrue value, But as an AVS, I want maximum security. Like there is no service in the world which wants to sacrifice security. So the limiting factor here is essentially the value accrual.
Yeah, so now with this operator sets, we can at least have some different classes defined, and you can have different stake sitting and different levels of security sitting in those. But that kind of distinction can be done for different type of transactions. So for example, for witness chain, I know that now they have, like, I'm a little bit outside it now, but I know that now they have a bridge pool which is separately for some of the bridges, and there's a separate one for networking protocol. And they have very different kind of security. There will be no slashing in a networking protocol security, for example. So that will happen. That distinction can happen across services.
There are any comments from the Gauntlet side in terms of analyzing the?
Yeah, I think one thing to kind of remember is that the bootstrapping phase for these networks will be completely different from the live demand phase, right? The bootstrapping phase is like looking at a new POS network that can control its inflation but has no fees. And so for the bootstrapping phase, a lot of it is focused on like how fast what is the minimum amount of inflation you can give to attract whatever your kind of view on the operator set is. I think the harder part is figuring out what the real, profit from an attack is to figure out what your security is, right? So like a question you could ask right now, and I guarantee you 0 people in the world will agree on the answer to this question, is what is the real amount of stake that Ethereum needs to be secure? Because if I look right now and I take the model of a BFT consensus protocol that says double spends are the worst attack, there's far more in stable coins than there is in stake on Ethereum, on Ethereum, right? So in some sense, if I really think it's a double spend that is the real thing that kills the network, then like Ethereum's under collateralized right now. But in reality, when you actually look, you actually see that there's sort of a couple other factors involved. So one is there's this hidden sort of like opportunity cost of attacking Ethereum. You actually destroy all the future block rewards. So if you're a staker and you participate in the attack, not only are you getting maybe the gain from doing the double spend, but you're also losing your future income. And in general, if you try to like write out, okay, like what is the real cost of attack, it's very complicated and it's very unlikely that anyone has like a single way of defining that they would agree on, which is kind of funny, right? Like, because a lot of, if I look at the UTXO type of blockchain like Bitcoin, it really is actually this double spend thing. But I think that's not true once you're sufficiently complicated. And I think AVSs are even one step further, more complicated to actually measure these costs of attacks, right? So like, in a non-slashing portion of an AVS, maybe the max profit from attack is just really low. All it does is like force you to do a view change or like effectively a reset, right? Well, maybe that has some cost to network, but that might be de minimis relative to the inflation. So the main point I'm bringing up here is actually, I think the hardest part is estimating the max profit that someone can, or even the average profit that someone gets from executing these attacks, especially given that the attack sort of end states are getting more complicated over time. So I think the best way to think about it is you can control your own inflation, so you can control sort of some notion of how much you want to spend right now at the cost of how much in the future you will have to spend. And you have to do that based on your sort of predictions of, when am I bootstrapping versus when am I in the demand phase. So that's sort of at a high level kind of what I'd say. I think this estimation of the real profit is one thing that, no one, it's sort of the elephant in the room that I feel like no one wants to talk about. Like
Just
Ethereum, what is it for Ethereum?
So some market play will be there as well, right? Like,
Yeah, exactly. The market will be pricing that effectively when you launch.
But from an AVS perspective, I know it's hard for Ethereum because it's, a large protocol. So from an AVS perspective, is it well understood from the AVSs that you talk to in terms of
Not
what
at
that
all.
profit could be?
Not at all. I mean, we can fool ourselves by circle jerking a bit, but to be honest, like as I said, like as a service, yes, there is like the cost to attack is hard to determine, and my revenue is also hard to determine because there is price discrepancy. Also, there are things like what is the value today? Am I in the still bootstrapping phase or am I not in my bootstrapping phase anymore. Like there have been protocols which have always been in bootstrapping phase for years, right? And they have been talking about training wheels for years. And I'm not, again, there are of course reasons to it. I'm not trying to criticize the people who are, doing a lot of good work in terms of pushing the boundaries of the protocols. But the point is, what I'm trying to mean here is, it's very hard for a service to sit and think very neatly about the cost to attack, the revenue towards that attack, and the externalities that arise from it. For example, like Avail is again sidetrack, but it's a POS network, and it is, there are rollups which are depending on it, and this is a pure L1 that has nothing to do with any other L2 or any of the AVSs. But for us also, it's very hard to determine, like, if Avail does or like a reversal of the chain, what kind of rollups are going to have what cascading effects onto their users. It's very hard for us to determine.
I mean, I understand it's hard, but ultimately it's going to come down to the AVSs to define that, right? As you rightly said, if you can't attract operators as an AVS, then there is no service, right? So while Eigen and everyone can do platform and analysis, ultimately it's the AVS that is probably going to define.
No, as I said, like
Yeah.
the definition that as an AVS I will probably try to make is, like as an AVS, I want the maximum security. I can have some order of yield that I can give, and that yield I will go to from people to people, again metaphorically speaking, of course. But I will go from door to door telling that I can give you this yield. Will you come and operate on my service? That is the selling task that all of these AVS are going to have to do. They make a very good market out of it, a platform out of it, so that this becomes much, much easier. It's not as hard as I make it to be. But at the end of the day, they are having to do their own selling.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, which is, I think the way to think of the restaking networks is more as platforms, the LRTs and liquid restaking tokens as aggregators, and sort of the AVSs and operators as two sides of the market who are sort of intermediated by the aggregators and others. And in these two-sided markets, the market participants who are pricing the value of the rewards are also giving some feedback to what they think the cost of attack is, right? It's not just that it's also static. It also depends on the actual market behavior. So at some level, you can kind of have a sort of first order model of things, but I don't think you can have a complete description because it does actually depend on, like, once things are live and people are trading this, you should really be thinking of people who are buying the AVS tokens as people who are speculating on, default events of a corporate bond. You can, like, sort of view the implied yield that you're getting from each AVS as sort of like, it's like a company that has a bond. The operators are sort of putting up capital or getting delegated capital to earn that yield. And the AVS token that's paid in reward is like earning equity that you're using to speculate on, like, what's the probability of default of this thing, right? In that sense, the market is also an input. It's not just purely the service that can construct this, which I think is worth remembering.
So in summary, this service will start at a particular point, when then the market will determine which services are sort of feasible and will kind of go on. Okay, I'll pause there on this topic, but I want to switch and talk a little bit more about designing slashing conditions and slashing, and in terms of enforceability a little bit more, right? So maybe Himanshu, I'll start with you. In terms of the AVSs that you look at and advise, what do you see as them taking into account when they are thinking about slashing conditions, whenever a slashing goes live?
No, so slashing conditions are more determined by the kind of protocol one wants to build. They come in many different varieties. For example, it can be I'm not sure if it's already enabled on the eigenlayer protocol, but for example, rather than a 0-1, there's some kind of leakage one wants to enable, right? Like what Ethereum does with the liveness, that if you're not available, then some small leakage will happen. That primitive will be very useful. Many of the slashing conditions people want is that kind of penalty, that if you are not able to do your job in time or something like that, you will leak some value. Or if you don't, it's not a 0-1 all the time. That's one thing that I see. Then 0 1s are more very objective faults that one will do. This I'm quite fascinated by not the slashing but the intersubjective part of the idea. That something can be done about it because see what's happening is that I think this is the previous question also relates to it. Is this is a very forward-looking thing? It's imagine instead of few Ethereum types ecosystem, now we want to think of several such microcosm, right? And they will have their own social layer. They will have their own all the layers. And I like to think that when you are talking to an AVS, you just talk to them and figure things out, and let the AVS figure out that thing. And then Gauntlet helps in figuring out the whole thing. It's a complex ecosystem. It won't be mathematically airtight. It's just that you gather knowledge and then you take decision about your investment, right? And maths is one of the part of that knowledge that okay, these are the guarantee these guys are giving. So slashing conditions also come in different varieties. Some small leakage. For example, I'll give an example from Sentient. When Sentient, we are thinking of this community build models. And when one has community build models, then there are two parts to those, right? One part is that you claim ownership on those models. And second is that those ownership rights are enforced. For both of them, one can provide cryptoeconomic security. When people are claiming ownership to models, there can be and many protocols are talking about it, there can be a challenge period within which those ownership rights can be argued. I don't know what kind of slashing will you apply to that. That, hey, you have not given me my ownership and the model is not even live, that there's no economy around it right now. So, and the second one would be then when actually the model is live and maybe it's being used in the way it's not supposed to be used. And then there is a very objective fault and you will have maybe a fixed amount of penalty for that. So both those kind of things will come up. This splitting of splash of the stake as this intersubjective thing comes into picture, that will be very interesting too.
Fair enough. Yash, I want to bring you in here. So, like Himanshu mentioned, slashing and even sort of the profit from sort of collusion is some things that we have to figure out. But what do you think about the role of cryptography in also sort of identifying which party is at fault and how do we sort of identify which party to sort of affect?
Thanks. Yeah, so my background is more in cryptography and cryptographic protocols, or let's say multi-party computation as opposed to cryptoeconomics. And we have, I guess, a rich theory that dates back to the 70s, 80s about how to, let's say, compute any function securely. How to decentralize the computation of, anything that involves private inputs and so on. It's relatively recently that a lot of these protocols have become practical and stimulated by, I guess, different use cases that come up. And one line of work that's particularly relevant to what we've been talking about here is multi-party computation with identifiable abort, right? Where the protocol itself guarantees that anyone who deviates from the protocol will be certifiably, identifiable. They can be certified as being, a malicious party, and that seems to align well with this notion of, slashing the stake of parties that deviate and so on. And so it seems to be a pretty natural fit from like identifiable abort to like sophisticated services that, provide cryptoeconomic security. But it's a pretty complex problem, and that I think the like high level idea of identifiable abort has been established for a while, but like now that we're thinking about actually deploying these things, there are a lot of interesting details that we need to figure out. Right? I mean, it's hard enough to get MPC to be efficient and working, properly in the honest case. Then there's the dishonest case, and then there's the like dishonest and identifiable case. And I think the fact that we now have these slashing mechanisms that can actually like use the like certifiability aspect of identifiable abort protocols, it will stimulate a lot of interesting research, I think. And yeah.
Got it. Okay, so I think one of the consensus is that a lot of things will have to be figured out and will be dynamic in terms of even price movements, the amount of assets that every AVS is covered. So I want to throw this question to both Tarun and Robert. in terms of building guardrails as a restaking platform and sort of building monitoring systems as these AVSs sort of start to support real assets and transactions? What do we need to do, or what do you see as things that you need to provide them in terms of monitoring systems, in terms of guardrails, for them to sort of be successful and thrive in this environment?
Okay, let me take that. And there's a lot of really great discussion points raised by everybody here. One of the ones relevant to this question that Tarun was talking about was about the difficulty of actually figuring out the real game theoretic Nash equilibrium, because it's very hard to model all of the factors that are driving people's decisions. And classically, a lot of people looked at proof of work chains and found that even though there were viable attacks, they didn't seem to be happening. And it was almost like the prisoner's dilemma. People would sort of take this attitude of like, oh, the game theory is not working. And that's never been right for prisoner's dilemma or anything else. It just means that the model is incomplete, which is very hard to like get all the right things, because, the model doesn't show you this like, reputational cost, and prisoner's dilemma is usually solved by people optimizing for the rest of their life, not that one decision. I think, it's a very big design space. This is not an engineering problem. This is not a business optimization problem. This is a design problem, figuring out what you do in slashing conditions. In those types of problems, it's very helpful to look at like past successes and failures and get an indication of like what that is pointing us out to. And so I'm most familiar with Ethereum. I think Tarun can talk about it for Cosmos and others, but one interesting point that really settled on from the Ethereum case was this idea that it should be essentially impossible to get caught in slashing conditions if you're following what you should be doing correctly. And that is actually like a willful choice. I think one of the interesting points is like Ethereum, for instance, just always chose that Raspberry Pi and very trivial hardware footprints, very trivial bandwidth was necessary. It's entirely possible that, in a more like OKR sense, that you could set appropriately, like this is a hard condition to meet. And, the mean target, instead of being 100% in Ethereum with the standard deviation of like 0.1%, like you start having a few slashing conditions, you just lose all reputation. Could be that, in general, it's hard to get to 70% and the standard deviation is 5%. And then everyone just looks at it and they're like, well, if you're in that main 70, 80%, you're a good operator. And then in cases like that, if it's necessary to do that, or if that's a better design point for slashing, then that just changes the rewards. It has to kind of cover the, sporadic nature of occasional slashings in those cases. I'm not saying it's necessary, but like every ABS can kind of decide what they're doing on that. And, one final point for the ABS is like we're very focused on the shared security, and a lot of us think about like corruption, side of security and then the cost for paying for that. I do just want to introduce a little bit that shared security, computation cost of operators, data cost of operators, bandwidth, all of those things, those are all cost of goods sold from an ABS point of view. And if you look at like AI protocols, dramatically expensive hardware with high carry costs. And so this idea of having operators that are driving to zero, 1%, 0.5%, that's probably not going to be the case. In a lot of ABSs that are more like middleware, you'll start seeing gross margins that start looking more like real companies. And that kind of gives you a perspective that the security aspect, you want to be efficient, but like there's a lot of markets where the security cost is not going to be a major part of the cost of goods sold. So, I just, again, saying it's complex design space. That aspect in particular, mixing together with security, is a part that I don't know there's a really good model yet. I think we're going to have to explore that. And then remind me the question to make sure that I bring this all back to what you asked.
I mean, it was more around guardrails and monitoring systems that we need to put in place so that, as these things are evolving, they can sort of course correct in terms of
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Okay. And so this then ties well to, you're just making the mention of intersubjective versus objective security. So, there are, like, on the SLA side, which in the regular Web 2 world is a lot of legal agreements, which are very hard to reasonably make efficient, lots of friction in them. So they're fairly useless, maybe reputation, but it doesn't even seem to happen that people really take huge reputation hits when they have large outages. So there'll be, things like that on chain. There's, witness chain and others, I'm sure, that will try to make those as objective as possible, have, like, actual observing voting committees and everything else. You will get to points, though, with things like data availability where there's no real objective on-chain, non-interactive proof you can provide. And that is where you get this interesting interplay with, intersubjective security, which really just means, like, people have to be, in a lot of cases, they're observing, and then they have to vote for a quorum that, observing it, they saw this withholding attack or something happening. And, the idea of being able to bond your intersubjective security and then do forks against those, like, external off-chain agreements with credible commitments, that, it's a important primitive. Ideally, it's not the dominant kind of security because it's probably going to be more difficult for people to use at scale, like objective security. But that one introduces this valuable thing, which is you can cause penalties against people staking that token that cause them to offset on-chain losses to people for their protocols. So it's a couple different factors, and I think this is a spot where, for probably most AVSs, they're going to appreciate, and I know we're pushing this direction of, like, taking on as much as possible of funding the R&D experiments and everything else, because this shouldn't be the primary concern. People who are building protocols want to do their special features, and they don't want to become experts in slashing and everything else. So as much as possible, push it up the stack where, finally it becomes trivial and there's, like, a few kind of simple options and you just pick them. But for people who are building, like Avail and others, very complex, deep blockchain protocols, then of course you have to really dive into it.
Cool. I think we're out of time as well. We could probably go on for another couple of hours, but just to close out, question to each of you, one thing that you're really excited about in the restaking space, and the top one or two things that you think still need to be solved for.
No, I am excited about the new models that will come on it. Like what Robert just said, that's actually very cool. Actually, this intersubjective part is very cool. Intersubjective is actually what we do every day in Web 2. And I don't think it will remain that way. People will try to make it objective in this space. For example, Shriram keeps on saying that, oh, this tyranny of majority part. But you take an intersubjective thing, make a vote, and let's say the winners take the stake of the losers. It's become objective. You build a small betting market on it, and it becomes objective. There'll be many, many interesting things that will happen, I feel there. I'm excited about those new models. It will, if it succeeds, it will go beyond these few boundaries that EigenLayer is defining right now, but it just requires lots of use cases to come up. And that's what drives it. So that's the part I'm excited about, that what will be these different use cases, how would these various instruments interplay with each other. What I need to improve, well, it's improving. I'm fine with it.
Okay, we'll have to do this quick fire style. So
yeah. So I think, very interesting developments happening in terms of what they enable, the marketplace, the platform that they enable, and the entire novelty around it of how easy it is to run up service and so on. So that's very cool to see. We need to solve for the sustainability of it. Like we have seen in cryptography for a very long time that the every day is very complex. Like you analyze those systems, you finally come to a protocol. The protocol is simple. Like the most of the novel cryptographic primitives that we use are extremely simple, although their journey has been extremely complex. But the final things are many times very simple because they are easy to model upon. They're easy to think about. They're easy to make rational choices on them. So I'm looking forward to getting to a place where the final outcomes are simplistic enough to be able to be rational, like make rational choices about.
Guess I'm excited to see particular real-world constraints that are being put in to inform our research on identifiable abort, and there are a lot of surprisingly foundational problems that need to be resolved in this area that we can tune to the context of operating a service and like defining slashing logic and that sort of thing. And yeah, that's what's interesting to me.
I'm kind of excited to see the first slashing event that, I feel like that's like the genesis block of this.
And something we still need to solve for.
Yeah,
To get to the point of slashing.
Yeah, I feel like the first slashing event is that's like a momentous occasion.
Put it into both categories.
Yeah, I'm also I'm excited on all of those things. Really good points. I'll add one other one, which is one thing that forking has given us in blockchain is I kind of consider to be one of the very unique superpowers of blockchain, because it viably says that a community can kind of override a majority who is mathematically correct, because they just decide that the majority takeover is unacceptable. And I think one of the things is like more generalizing forking, on Ethereum 1 and others, like been very clear that after the DAO hack, so problematic that it's almost impossible. Vitalik and others have been really clear, like don't overload layer 1. We really can't do this for people. But if we lower the threshold, it's still a fairly big, it's a big thing to do forking even under intersubjective conditions. But it's always kind of been that way with the law and human behavior. Most people don't commit crime because they're afraid that if they do it, they will get caught that one time. But they do see that, viably over time, if they kind of follow that behavior pattern, something bad will happen to them. And so this idea about having like an ostensible big penalty that can be imposed causes thousands of times amplification of the correct following the behavior, without having to actually have a lot of, individual objective-wise, and especially with the nons, it's harder to know that. But as you start putting in humans and shared beliefs, we're getting closer to the sort of like human constructed systems. And there can be a lot of efficiency with that. We'll have to see what it looks like. But my view has always been in crypto that, it's really good to do as much as you can mathematically, but crypto systems, if they totally remove the human sentiment aspect and human judgment aspect, then they're really missing a part of the game theory space. And so I'm excited that we're finally able to, have constructs cryptoeconomically to put those on chain.
Cool. I think that's a good point to end. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you for the audience as well. I think there's a lot of stuff that we sort of covered, and a lot of things to think about in the future. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Great questions, by the way. Thank you.